interview with Rabbi Michael Mandel. This is tape 10. Rabbi Mandel, you were telling me about when you were sent off here to the south of Hungary to find hidden Jewish children. What happened?
Well, I went to convents. I went to small landowners' places. Just went there by train, and I had a little, like a wooden army box, that was all my earthly possession. All I needed was there. And
did you have formal documentation to show the people who you were?
Yes, as a matter of fact, from the International Red Cross. At one stage, the International Red Cross, whether it was given or was taken, we had the letterheads, and some of my senior friends in the movement, the Zionist youth movement, wrote out certificates and just signed it, and that was good enough.
What was your brief? What were you trying to achieve?
My brief was to try and find them and eventually collect them, not on my own, because I couldn't possibly do that. They were young children, some of them were quite young, but the ones that altogether the group put together, 167 of them, and we took them to a summer camp. There are 3 mountain ranges in Hungary, Slovakia, that part of it, Tatra, Matra and Fatra. And there were some beautiful spas there, some holiday resorts there in those mountains. And we took them to one of them and spent the most wonderful, wonderful, revitalizing time, because we were all worn out by the experience. And that was in 1945. And before my sister got very bad, then I came back and looked after her, but I went away for several weeks and did that. And in the camp, they were taught by madrichim, by guides, by group leaders. We learned about like Tzofiyut, that is scouting and that sort of thing. We had campfires and singing and so on, all those things. It was a very, very pleasant time for all and sundry. Some of the children had already no parents. They never came back. They were murdered. And some perhaps came back later on, but I don't know about them. But this first group of youngsters was taken, they arrived in Israel the beginning of May 1946. The person who was their group leader was known with us by Pitzi, which means tiny, like a tiny tot, a tiny, the word tiny, Pitzi. Like through the tulips, you know, that person. What's the name of that person? I can't remember now. It doesn't
Tiny
matter.
Tim.
Pitzi, that was his name, and Pitzi was the one who was asked to take them to, he was the group leader, and eventually they did arrive to Israel, to Palestine at the time in '46. And but I wanted to come to Israel too, but my uncle said, look, I've come from Australia to collect the remnants of my family. Don't make me any difficulties. Come with me. Thank goodness I've got plenty of money. If you want to go to Israel anytime, I'll get you the ticket and you can go. But you come first to Australia. And I want you to meet with your sister. You want that, don't you? I said, of course I want it. Well, he arranged that he cabled his wife and said that to get a landing permit for my sister and myself, and eventually the permit arrived, and we met in Paris, not having seen her since 1943, when I left my hometown, and we met in Paris, but we went from, it's task to tell you that Mr. Chillog took us to, my cousin and myself, to Komarom. From there I went over, we got a temporary pass for 3 days to visit Komarno, and we forgot to come back because we would not want to be drafted into the military, and we were military age at the time, both he and myself. And from there we went, from Komarno we went to Prešburg or Požoň, Bratislava. From Bratislava we went to, as deaf and mute, the two of us, because we couldn't speak Czech. They hated the Hungarians and they hated the Germans. And Russian I could speak, but only very little, not enough to. But we went through the bridge, and we were allowed to pass, and I went to the Jewish community center that had a place where we could sleep. And next day we went at night through Brno to Prague.
How did you travel this whole time? By what mode of transport?
That was by train from Bratislava to Prague through Brno.
Did you have exit papers and?
Nothing. We arrived in Prague without any papers, without anything.
How did you cross the border?
But there was no crossing. As I told you, we had got a pass to cross the border from Hungary to Czechoslovakia. Once we were in Czechoslovakia, there was no problem. I mean, there could have been problem, but fortunately we did not have any problem.
Where was your destination at this point with your uncle?
To go to Prague, to meet up with a cousin who has become quite famous after. His name is Jorge Mantello. He bought it for himself, that office, in order to be able to get the letterheads and stamps and so on, the rubber stamps. He issued passports and visas and all sorts of things for several thousand Jews. He became one of the secretaries of the Consulate General of Salvador, and in that capacity he traveled. He had his own passport, a diplomatic passport, and all that, a consular passport, and he came to Prague, and with an ex-military aircraft, Air Force plane, together with my uncle Geza and Mr. Brown, a businessman from Romania, from America. Altogether 14 people could go on that plane, and we paid proper fares, and we went to Switzerland. again without papers, but he just took us over. He said, it's all right, it's with me, they are my guests. And so they allowed us to pass. He was well known in the place. I'm sure that some of the passport officers had the benefit of his generosity from time to time, but no doubt about that. But they allowed us to pass, and I was in Geneva together with Mr. Brown, my uncle, and Mandel, George Mantello, and his son, Americo. My son Daniel knows, he was, as a matter of fact, there at his last birthday before he passed on.
At this point, how long had it been since you had seen your sister?
When I was in Switzerland, I did not yet see my sister. That was in '46.
When was the last time you had seen her before that?
In July '43.
Where?
In my hometown, Shimleu. My late father, may he rest in peace, took me out to the train station, and together with my brother Yankee. It was around midnight that I caught the train to Oradea to visit my mother's grave, on the way to go to Budapest.
Do you remember saying goodbye to your father at that point?
Pardon?
Do you remember saying goodbye to your father then?
He blessed me, and we were in correspondence subsequently, but I have never seen him again. July '43, that was the last time I've seen him.
Do you remember the last thing he said to you or you said to him?
All I can remember is that he put his hands on my head and he blessed me. Send me on my way. I went to visit my mother's grave, and from there I went to Budapest, to my uncle, where I stayed with him till '44, until the Nazis came in, etc.
Moving on now to Switzerland, how long did you stay there?
Just for the one day.
Then what happened?
Maybe two days. From then on, at night or in the evening, my cousin took us with his car to the railway station in Geneva and put us on a train to Paris. Zoli and I, or my cousin and myself, arrived there. I knew 14 French words, and he knew about 3 or 4, my cousin. He was an anti-talent for languages.
What about your uncle? Where was he at this time?
No, he stayed on in business, and he stayed on in Geneva, and went back to London eventually, and came back to Australia. He was originally he went on a business trip, and he combined it with this business of taking us. In Prague we stayed with a cousin on my mother's side, the Schreiber, the niece of that Schreiber who gave a chance to Wally, Ratswally, who hid my uncle eventually and aunt. She lived in Prague, or rather, she lived in Prague with her husband. Her husband was, by that time, because he served in the Czech Legion, he was the army prosecutor, what they call the advocate general, I don't know what they call it. Anyway, he was a lawyer, a trained lawyer, and he was there.
Tell me about...
I stayed at his place for 3 weeks.
Tell me about seeing your sister, meeting your sister in Paris.
Pardon?
Tell me about meeting your sister in Paris.
Well, my sister, my cousin and I arrived and we had to rely on our resources, and nobody waited for us anywhere. We had the address. It was Hotel Trianon Palace, just off Boulevard Saint-Michel in Paris. And we got there, and that's where we met my uncle, Jenny, and Serene, the ones who were there at my sister's funeral as well, where I stayed with them, the one who had that factory in Budapest. They were also there, and we met up there.
Tell me about that meeting.
There was a distant relation of ours who lived in Drancy. That's the place which was most dreaded by the French Jews, as you know. She was also present when we arrived. She brought some milk, which was hard to get in those days, even in Paris, for my auntie and for my sister. And she baked some very nice yeast cake and so on, some butter cake. And we went to a restaurant and ate there. And that's where we met in the Hotel Trianon Palace with my sister. My sister arrived a bit earlier from Sweden.
How did your sister look?
She looked terrific. By that time she was, since 45 May, she was in Copenhagen and Sweden, and she was already living under normal, peaceful conditions. She worked for a Tante Frida Osten, that was her name. It's a Christian lady. She said one Sunday morning, "Aren't you coming to church?" She said, "But I am Jewish." He says, "It doesn't matter, you come to church." She did not realize the difference at all. She was a Christian, very nice, devoted Christian woman. And they were in correspondence for years subsequently. She had a son who was an army officer, a Swedish army officer.
How long did you stay in Paris?
In Paris from July, end of July, beginning of August, I can't remember exactly. It was till we left, which was in October. We left in October, had to wait for there were very few ships in those days, very few boats. We came with a Messagerie Maritime, my sister, and my auntie's aunt, who was also her stepmother, my uncle's mother-in-law. We came, the three of us, on the same boat.
What was the name of the boat?
SS Monkai.
How long did that journey take?
We went through a number of countries, and it was a 5-week journey until we got to Saigon.
Do you remember the ports that you stopped off along the way?
Yes, we stopped at Port Said. We stopped at Djibouti. We stopped in Bombay. We stopped in Singapore. And we arrived in Saigon. We were supposed to be there for maybe a few days, but the French authorities requisitioned the boat to take some ammunition and some military supplies, some trucks and so on, to Hanoi. So we were stranded there. We would not have minded very much, but my uncle paid for a first-class passage, and were put into a military camp using the same facilities as the very, very primitive soldiers.
How long were you there?
We were there until the 40 Europeans were killed under French regime, it was at that time. And some of the Foreign Legion people were also there. And when this happened, I sent a cable to my uncle to get us out from the place, which he did.
How long was your stay in Saigon?
In Saigon, about a month. I think we left about the 10th or 11th of January.
How did you leave?
By Dutch airline, the branch, the Indonesian branch of KLM. We went from Saigon back to Singapore, from Singapore to Batavia, which is now called Yogyakarta, and from there to Darwin, Brisbane, Sydney. It took us, by my sister and my auntie's stepmother and aunt, there were only 2 seats on the plane, and I asked the ladies to go, and I stayed there in Adek camp. That was a Japanese prisoner of war camp.
Where was this?
In Batavia, in Indonesia. And I had a horrible toothache and not even an aspirin or anything.
How long were you there?
For 4 days, until I could also get the next flight out. With that, I went back, as I say, to Singapore from Batavia I came straight to Darwin. And it took several days until we got there. I arrived during the middle of the night, and for the first time it was so hot, and mosquitoes were more than the sand on the seashore. And we were treated very, very hospitably by the people there. Next day I caught a plane to go to, my sister went ahead. She arrived 4 days before me. And I took a plane to Brisbane from Darwin. And I remember I gave a £1 note to the greengrocer. I wanted to have an orange, and he said, I said, give me an orange for. I said, it's not enough. I mean, I just could gesticulate, and it was an Italian shopkeeper, and anyway, he gave me a whole dozen of oranges and gave me back the change. It was a few pennies in those days in Queensland in '46. And next day I came by Ansett to Sydney, from Brisbane to Sydney. I arrived on the 18th of January, my sister's birthday. It was a Saturday, and I arrived in Martin Place. It was as dead as a dodo. There was nothing there. Absolutely nobody. Only the bus that came from the airport. That's all. There was not a person in sight or anything. And I took a taxi who took me down. He disregarded the meter and just took from me, I think, about 14 or so many shillings, which was an outrageously big fare. and he took me across the bridge, harbour bridge, and he asked me, how do you like our harbour bridge? Bridge I understood because I knew it from my lessons about the bridge, the London Bridge over the Thames. And anyway, he took me to Roseville, to my uncle's place. They were celebrating my sister's birthday. And that was on a Saturday. And next Tuesday I started to work in the factory of my uncle. And a few weeks later I was given the bunch of keys to the factory to open it and close it. I was working quite hard there.
How did you cope with the English language?
I immediately started the Australian Jewish Welfare Society in Sydney, had a course for migrants. It was conducted by Mr. H. Savage, who was the principal of the Sydney Technical High School Modern Languages teacher, Modern Languages Department. He served in the First World War. He spoke French fluently. He was a very good teacher, and he spoke also English. That was his mother tongue. And he taught us and he reminded us very, very sternly that we must pay our fees per term. It was 10 guineas, which is a lot of money in those days. Of course, everybody paid up, but we did not know that he didn't collect it for himself. At the end of the term, he went to the Welfare Society office and he says, "This is my contribution for the newcomers to this country." He didn't take a penny and he was so solicitous on our behalf. We learned English from, I had there on Monday and Wednesday evening from 7:30 to 9:30, 2 hours per session. He taught us very patiently and very diligently.
How long did...
And I visited quite a bit of the cinema in order to see the action and the speech and so on. And I did want to learn English. It took me about 2 years until I really grasped it, but the second year I enrolled at Metropolitan College to do my matric. And after mid-year we had a test, and out of 63 students I came 7th in English literature, because whilst the others were sort of fiddling around, I was really learning day and night. I had to go to work. I worked double shift twice a week, 3 times a week. I went to the classes the other nights. I got up at 4:45 in the morning and came home sometimes at about 12:15. If I was lucky, I came with a train before 11:45. And then eventually I went to live another place in Belfields. My auntie, who passed away last year, she was 92. She survived Auschwitz, thanks due to the fact that my sister stole some food and threw it across the barbed wire, the electrified barbed wire, for her and for her 2 daughters, one of whom is still alive and lives in Sydney. And I lived there for a while and worked there for the first